There's a fair amount of confusion surrounding the birth of Jesus today, and this is partly because there's two accounts of his birth in the Bible, and they aren't the same. They cover almost all different events, but these often get combined into one. For example, nativity scenes often have the wise men and the shepherds at the manger visiting Jesus at the same time. But Luke talks about the shepherds and Matthew talks about the wise men. My point here isn't to make any big deal about what should be in a nativity scene, but rather just to go through the story of Jesus' birth and put it into one story that you can easily do yourself in Matthew and Luke. What time of year Jesus was born isn't stated. It probably wasn't December 25th. Most people who studied it think it was likely in the spring sometime, but that really doesn't matter because the Bible doesn't say. The easiest and laziest solution to why Matthew and Luke are different is that they're made up stories. If you want an easy answer to any question about history where you have to do a little bit of thinking to figure out what happened and when and how two accounts can both be true even if they're different. If you want an easy way out of that, just say it's wrong, it's made up. You can do that. That's lazy. But just a little bit of careful reading and thinking, and it isn't really that hard to figure out the sequence of events described by Matthew and Luke. Matthew starts with the genealogy of Joseph, Jesus' legal father. And if you look back in the Old Testament, you can see that Matthew deliberately skips some generations in this genealogy. And that'll be important when we get to Luke's genealogy, which is different. As far as the accounts of Jesus' birth go, we start with Luke. Luke chapter 1 first goes through the story of the conception of John the Baptist, whose parents, Zacharias and Elizabeth, had been unable to have children. But Zacharias is given a prophecy that Elizabeth will have a son, and his name shall be called John. You can read this all in Luke chapter 1. Next, the angel appears to Mary and tells her she's going to have a baby, but it's going to be a virgin birth. He also tells Mary of Elizabeth's pregnancy, and Mary goes off to visit Elizabeth. Mary stayed with Elizabeth for about 3 months and then went back home. The rest of Luke 1 talks about the birth of John the Baptist. After Mary goes home, the story picks up in Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25, where Mary is found to be with child, and Joseph contemplates divorcing her secretly. They were betrothed, which means that Jesus would not just be a baby out of wedlock in the eyes of the people, but it would actually be adultery against her husband. So he would have had the right to make a big spectacle of her infidelity, as people would have seen it. But he didn't want to do that because he was a good man. He was going to try to end the relationship secretly. But then the angel appeared to him and said, "Do not be afraid to take to you Mary, your wife." So she was, in a legal sense, his wife, but he had not taken her to himself yet, and there had been no sex, of course. And it says he kept her a virgin until Jesus was born. The story picks up again in Luke chapter 2. There's the census, and they have to go from Nazareth, where they live, to Bethlehem. So Joseph and Mary travel to Bethlehem, and Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And this is where we see the shepherds. They come to the manger because there was no room for them in the inn. So the shepherds come to them at the manger. And then after Jesus is born, they travel to Jerusalem to get Jesus circumcised, and also they have to perform a sacrifice for the new birth, which would be a lamb unless you can't afford it, in which case you sacrifice two birds when they chose birds. So that means that Joseph and Mary were poor. After they did everything according to the law, and they meet Simeon and Anna, you can read all about this in Luke chapter 2, they go back home to Nazareth. Sometime in here, the Magi, or the wise men in the east, see the star, and they start traveling. And so the wise men come to Jerusalem, which is only a few miles from Bethlehem, although Jerusalem and Bethlehem are a long way from Nazareth. So they come to Herod the king, and they say, "We've come to see the one born king of the Jews." And Herod asks the religious leaders, "Where do the prophets say that Christ is to be born?" And they said, "Bethlehem." And Herod, of course, decides he wants to kill Jesus. So he tries to get the wise men to tell him when they've found him, of course not telling them that he's planning to kill Jesus. So the star appears again, and they go follow the star, and the star leads them to the house where Joseph and Mary and Jesus are in Bethlehem. But wait, I thought they went back to Nazareth after they were in Jerusalem. That's true. So how did they end up back in Bethlehem again? The Bible doesn't say. I can think of 3 reasons Joseph and Mary might have moved to Bethlehem. 1, it's possible Mary thought that her son, if he's the Messiah, should grow up in Bethlehem. Or it's possible that Joseph found business opportunities on their trip for the census. Or perhaps the 3 months Mary spent with Elizabeth prompted her to want to be closer to Elizabeth and Zacharias and John. It's not clear exactly where Zacharias and Elizabeth lived. It said the hill country of Judea, but that's far closer to Bethlehem than it is to Nazareth. The Bible doesn't say, but people move. So evidently they moved. How long after the birth is this? Well, when Herod finds out that the wise men tricked him because they were warned by God and went back home another way and didn't return to Herod to tell him where Jesus was, he went in a rage and sent people to kill children in Bethlehem, boys 2 years old and under. So I'm going to suggest that Jesus was roughly 2 years old when the wise men visited. Plenty of time for Joseph and Mary to have decided to move to Bethlehem. Why doesn't the Bible tell us why they moved? Well, Matthew and Luke are each telling us what they know. It's possible Matthew didn't know the account that Luke tells us about. And it's possible Luke didn't know the events that Matthew tells us about. They're just both telling us the events they know. Both sets of events are true. So after the wise men visit, Joseph is warned by God. Joseph takes Jesus and Mary to Egypt to get away from Herod. Later, Joseph is told that Herod is dead, so he can go back to the land of Israel. On the way back, he's afraid to go to Judea, where Bethlehem is, because of Herod's son, and he's warned again. So where do they go? Natural place to go is back to Nazareth, where they came from. So they go to Nazareth, and Jesus is brought up in Nazareth. In Luke chapter 3, there's a second genealogy of Jesus. Now, the Matthew genealogy goes forwards from Abraham to Joseph, whereas Luke goes backwards from Joseph all the way to Adam. Now, as we said about skipped generations, the genealogies are different, but we all have multiple genealogies. You can trace everything through your father or grandfather or great-grandfather or wherever you want to start, all the way back. A genealogy can start with a father or it can start with a grandfather, and in their language, father just means a male ancestor. It doesn't have to mean direct father. It could be grandfather, great-grandfather, etc. So Matthew leads us through one set of fathers, and Luke leads us through another set of fathers. It may be that the genealogy that Luke gives goes through Joseph's mother or grandmother or great-grandmother, or people have suggested that it may go through his father-in-law, which would mean that we're given Mary's genealogy. It doesn't explicitly say. So that's the basic story of Jesus' birth. You can read about it in Matthew 1 and 2, Luke 1 and 2, with the second genealogy being in Luke chapter 3.